The diner went quiet the moment they walked through the door. Not gradually, like a curtain dropped from the ceiling. Fast and final. 6 men in black suits. No wasted movement. Eyes that had learned long ago not to look at anything they didn't intend to keep. The waitress stopped mid-pour. A trucker at the counter found something very interesting about the rim of his coffee cup. A young couple near the window asked for their check without finishing their food. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody moved unless they had to. The air itself seemed to tighten. At the center of it all, the boss. Dark suit, crisp and immaculate, rings on every finger, and climbing up the left side of his neck, unmistakable even from across the room, an anchor tattoo. Thick black lines, an old-school design, deliberate and permanent. And beneath the anchor, in careful cursive script, 2 names, Hanan and Biag. He'd carried that tattoo for 30 years. He'd chosen those names himself, the morning his son was born. And as far as Vincent Caruso had told himself, as far as he'd had to believe, only one other person on earth had ever worn that same design, in that same placement, with Hanan and Biag written in that same ink. His son. His missing son. He was mid-sentence, saying something to the man on his left, when the voice reached him from the corner booth near the window. Calm. Steady. Completely without fear. "Sir, my son has that same tattoo." Every head in that diner turned, not toward Vincent, toward her. Small, maybe 70, silver hair pinned back, hands folded neatly on the table in front of a cup of black coffee. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't looking away. She was looking directly at him. And for the first time in 30 years, Vincent Caruso froze mid-sentence. "Before we go any further, I want you to ask yourself something. What would you do if the person you'd spent 30 years trying to find wasn't discovered by investigators, or money, or the kind of quiet institutional reach that men like Vincent Caruso had always been able to apply to problems? What if they were found by a 70-year-old woman in a blue cardigan, sitting alone in a New Jersey diner with a worn leather Bible on the table beside her coffee? What would that do to you? What would it undo? Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We tell stories worth staying for. Vincent turned slowly. She was already looking at him, not with nervousness, but with the direct, unhurried clarity of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times and decided that when it arrived, she would not waste a single word. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "My name is Margaret Ellis, and I think you might know my son." The diner was completely still. "What's his name?" Vincent asked. His voice was quiet, controlled. But his hands, flat on the counter, had gone very still. Margaret reached into her purse without rushing. She placed a photograph on the counter between them. A man in his early 30s, dark hair, strong jaw. Vincent's jaw, if you knew what to look for. And on the left side of his neck, the anchor tattoo. Thick black lines. The cursive script beneath, Hanan and Biag. Identical to the one on Vincent's neck. The same names, the same placement, the same ink, 30 years and 1 generation apart. Vincent touched the edge of the photograph. Just the edge. The way a man touches something that might dissolve if handled wrong. A muscle moved along his jaw. That was all. "Where is he?" Barely above a whisper. Margaret held his gaze. "He's in the hospital," she said. 6 days. And he's been asking for you." Vincent Caruso, the man his men had never once seen flinch, sat at that counter for a full 60 seconds without moving, without speaking, without doing anything except breathing. In that silence, something that had been braced shut for 30 years began, with the slow finality of something structural giving way to open. You want to know why those names, Hanan and Biag, existed on two necks in the same family. To understand that, you have to go back to one night in Philadelphia, one conversation, 5 words that broke something between a father and a son and left them 30 years apart. His name was Vincent Caruso, youngest of 4 brothers from South Philadelphia. His older brothers called him Shadow, always just behind them, watching, learning, saying nothing. By 16, he had absorbed everything he needed to know about how the world actually worked. Not the version they gave you in school. The other one. The one running beneath. Quiet and permanent. Through handshakes and favors and the specific language of men who understood that loyalty was not a sentiment. It was a structure you built and maintained, or it collapsed and buried you. By his mid-30s, he was the boss, head of one of the most feared and respected families in the Northeast. He was not a cruel man. People who knew him well would tell you he had a code. Keep your word. Protect your family. Never put your hands on someone who can't fight back. That code was real. He lived by it. But codes, like walls, have gates. And Vincent had not always known who was standing on the other side of his. The names Hanan and Biag came from that code. 2 men from Vincent's early years, both long dead by the time Daniel was born, who had shaped everything he'd ever become. Not by teaching him to be hard, but by teaching him to be faithful. They had shown him, each in their own way, that a man who cannot be trusted by the people nearest to him is not powerful. He is simply dangerous. There is a difference. Vincent had understood that difference since he was 18. When Daniel turned 21, Vincent folded a piece of paper and handed it across the table. The tattoo design, drawn by hand. He didn't explain it. He said only, "These names kept me honest. Maybe they'll do the same for you." Daniel went and got it done 3 days later. He never told his father why he'd moved so fast. Daniel grew up inside 2 worlds simultaneously. At home, he was the son of a man who read bedtime stories and once drove 4 hours through a snowstorm to watch a middle school science fair. Outside, in the rooms his father moved through, in the things Daniel overheard and the things he was never supposed to see, he absorbed a different kind of education. One that left marks no tattoo could cover. As he grew older, those marks didn't fade. They became questions, then arguments. Then, at 22, an ultimatum. I'm not doing this anymore. He meant the life, the name, the role written for him before he was born. He wanted out. He wanted ordinary. And Vincent, who had never once been asked to account for what the life cost the people inside it, had not handled it well. There were things said that night that neither of them could walk back. Daniel left the next morning. And for 30 years, nothing. Vincent had searched, quietly, carefully, for years. Every resource applied to one person who had gone to extraordinary lengths not to be found. Daniel had changed his last name, moved across state lines, left no thread. After a decade of nothing, Vincent reached the only conclusion that a man like him could survive. He told himself Daniel was simply gone, not dead, just gone. He locked that part of himself away and stopped knocking. What Vincent did not know, what could not have been known, because it had never been spoken, was that Daniel had not only left out of anger or principle. There had been a man, a figure from the outer edge of Vincent's world, Not inner circle, not trusted, but connected enough to have been in certain rooms, privy to certain conversations, and patient enough to understand the specific value of a young man who was the boss's only son. He had made contact with Daniel twice in the months before Daniel left. Not threats exactly. Quieter than that. On the first time, he appeared at Daniel's apartment building on a Wednesday morning and said only that he hoped Vincent's son was enjoying his life and that he hoped things stayed that way. The second time, he was waiting in the parking lot of the restaurant where Daniel worked part-time, and he said, "Your father has a lot of people around him. You don't." He smiled when he said it. Then he left. Daniel was 22 years old. He had no way to know whether his father was aware of this man's behavior or whether this was something operating entirely beneath Vincent's notice. He did know one thing with complete clarity. If he brought this to his father, he would be pulled deeper into the structure he was trying to leave, the investigation, the retaliation, the protection. All of it would enclose him further. He would become an asset to be secured. He thought about telling him for 3 weeks. Then he thought about the woman he was seeing, the life outside Philadelphia he kept imagining, the child he one day wanted to have in a house without this particular kind of shadow over it. And he understood, with the cold, unglamorous certainty of someone doing arithmetic on their own survival, that he could not build that life here, that leaving had to be complete. That partial escape was not escape at all. So Daniel Ellis of Western New Jersey was born. No connection, no past, no surface. For 30 years, it worked. Vincent had eventually dealt with the man in question, years later, through the quiet channels that left no paperwork. He assumed the threat, whatever it had been, had dissolved into the past. He never knew what it had cost. He never knew his son had been calculating his way out of danger while Vincent assumed the boy was simply rejecting him. Now, absorbing that knowledge in stages in a diner in New Jersey, Vincent felt something he had not felt in decades and could not immediately name. It was not grief, exactly. Not anger. It was more specific than either. The sensation of a man who has run a precise operation for 30 years, discovering that the most consequential variable had never been on his map. Margaret Ellis had not planned to walk into Millie's diner that Tuesday morning. She had been driving back from St. Anthony's Medical Center in Trenton, where Daniel had been for 6 days following a cardiac event the doctors were still describing with words like, "We're monitoring closely." She had stopped because she had been crying in the car and needed 10 minutes before she could drive any further. She had no idea who was sitting at that counter. But she had recognized the Hanan and Biag tattoo the moment she walked past him. She would have recognized it anywhere. Daniel Ellis had moved to her town at 23, rented the apartment above her garage, helped with groceries, fixed her porch steps in autumn without being asked. When her husband of 40 years died of a stroke on a January evening, Daniel had sat with her through the entire night and asked nothing in return. He had become her son in everything but blood. She had asked about the tattoo once, years ago. He looked at it for a long moment. "It's for people I used to love," he said. She hadn't pressed. Some doors, she understood, were closed for reasons that deserved to be respected. 6 days ago, in the hospital, Daniel had told her everything. The real name, the real father, the man in the parking lot, the 22-year-old calculation that had become a 30-year life. "I don't know if he'd want to hear from me," Daniel had said, his voice thin and careful. "I don't know if I deserve to ask, but I would like him to know." He hadn't finished the sentence. Margaret had squeezed his hand. "I'll find him," she said. She had no last name, no address, No way to reach a man her son had spent a lifetime carefully staying invisible from. But she had the Hanan and Biag anchor. And she had 30 years of quiet, unconditional love for a man she considered her own. Which, as it turns out, Dim is a more powerful locator than most people appreciate. She had spent 4 days driving to diners within 20 miles of the Philadelphia line, describing the tattoo to waitresses and counter regulars, asking, calmly, without alarm, whether they'd seen a man who wore it. A woman named Patrice at Millie's had said, "That sounds like it might be Tuesday's man." Margaret came back on Tuesday, and there he was. Now, watching Vincent absorb what she'd told him, she recognized something in his face that she had seen before. In Daniel's face. In the hospital. The moment he finished telling her the full story and fell silent. It was the specific expression of a man looking at 30 years from the other side and seeing, for the first time, its actual shape. "How bad is he?" Vincent asked. "All authority gone." "Bad enough that he asked me to find you," Margaret said. "And Daniel does not ask for things easily." A beat. Then, "Tell me which hospital." He stood. "I'll drive myself." He told his men to stay, all 5 of them. He saw the looks, the practiced alertness of people who had spent years beside him and had never once been left behind, and he ignored them. He got in his own car and pulled onto Route 9 heading north, and for 40 miles he drove in a silence that had nothing peaceful in it. Vincent Caruso had built his entire adult life on the precision of his own judgment. His ability to read a room, a man, in a situation, to understand what was actually happening beneath what appeared to be happening, was not a talent he'd been given. It was a skill he'd refined across decades of decisions where being wrong had consequences that couldn't be undone. He had been wrong before, tactically, operationally, in the way that any man running anything complex is occasionally wrong. But there was always a corrective, always a next move. He had never once been wrong about something he could not fix. He was wrong about this, not tactically, fundamentally. He had spent 30 years believing his son had left because he was young and principled and could not accept the reality of who his father was. That version had been livable. It had made Daniel the idealist and Vincent the pragmatist, and the distance between them a disagreement between 2 people who both believed they were right. That was a story Vincent could carry. What he was carrying now was different. His son had left because a man operating within Vincent's own structure had stood in a parking lot and quietly threatened a 22-year-old who had nowhere to bring it. And that 22-year-old, rather than come to his father, because coming to his father meant being consumed by the very thing he was trying to survive, had simply disappeared, completely, permanently, alone. Somewhere around exit 7, Vincent pulled onto the shoulder and stopped the car. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, the engine idling, the gray November sky pressing down flat against the highway. 30 years of a particular kind of certainty, the kind that a man like him requires just to function, had not collapsed dramatically. It had gone quiet. The way a building goes quiet in the seconds before something structural gives. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He gave himself 90 seconds. Then he put the car back in drive. St. Anthony's Medical Center. The cardiac unit nurse gave him the room number without hesitation. He walked the corridor slowly, footsteps quiet on linoleum. He passed a window looking out onto a gray November sky and thought about a different hospital corridor 34 years ago, when he had been 26 years old and had to press his back against the wall outside the delivery room, because what he felt coming was too large, too immediate. and he had needed a moment to brace against the sheer weight of it. He had not been prepared enough. He never could have been. Room 114. He stopped outside. Through the narrow glass panel he could see the figure in the bed. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that was his own jaw, returned to him across 30 years. And on the left side of the neck, even through the glass, the edge of the anchor. Hanan and Biag. He pushed the door open. Daniel turned his head at the sound. The careful, inconserving movement of someone for whom motion was still an effort. And then he saw his father. Neither of them spoke. The monitors beeped their small, steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and was answered. The world continued its ordinary business. Vincent crossed the room, pulled the chair from the corner to the bedside. Close, the way you sit when proximity is the only remaining language, and sat down. He looked at his son, at the gray at his temples, peace at the lines around his eyes, at 30 years of a life lived in deliberate, necessary invisibility. Then he said, "I know about the man." A long silence. The monitor beeped. Daniel's eyes moved to the ceiling. "He's been gone a long time," Vincent said. "I didn't know what he wanted from you. I should have seen it." He stopped. He did not dress it up. "I didn't." Daniel looked back at him. Something moved across his face. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the thing that comes before forgiveness, the thing that makes it possible. "I know you didn't," he said. A pause. "I know." That was the crack in the wall. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just two men in a hospital room, quietly acknowledging the exact shape of what had broken between them. After that, they talked. 4 hours. About the night Daniel left and the words that couldn't be recovered. About the life Daniel had built in New Jersey. The carpentry work. The woman he'd loved and lost to cancer at 41. In the son named Thomas, who was now 11 and had never known this man sitting beside his father's bed. About Vincent's years. Quieter than anyone on the outside would have guessed. More than once the room went silent, and they let it. They were Caruso men. They understood that silence, used correctly, carries more than words. At some point, neither of them could have said exactly when, Daniel placed his hand on his father's arm. Not a gesture, just contact. The specific, grounded contact of a man confirming that something he had long stopped expecting to feel is, against all reasonable probability, still there. Vincent looked down at his son's hand. Then he covered it with his own. The monitors kept their rhythm. The November light held in the window. Outside in the parking lot, 5 men in dark suits sat in a car and waited, without being told why, for as long as was needed. I want to pause here for a moment, because this, right here, is the kind of conversation that most people never get to have. The kind that requires one person to find the other before time runs out. Think about that. Is there someone in your life you've been circling? Someone you've let too much distance accumulate with? You don't need a diner and a tattoo and a woman who spent 4 days driving around New Jersey. You just need to go first. Daniel was discharged 11 days later. His condition had stabilized. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. He would need to slow down, monitor things, return regularly. But he was going home. And for the first time in 30 years, that word didn't carry absence inside it like a stone in a coat pocket. Vincent drove him. His own car, just the two of them, the radio on low. They stopped at Millie's on the way. Of course they did. Patrice poured them both coffee before they sat down. Yi looked at the two of them side by side and said nothing. She had worked that counter for 20 years. She understood that some moments don't need a single word added to them. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, took the stool beside Daniel, accepted her coffee, and listened to the two men talk with the settled quiet of a person who has done exactly what they came to do and is now simply present for the rest of it. At one point, Vincent looked over at her and said, "I don't know how to thank you." Margaret considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Buy my coffee and we're even." Vincent laughed, a short, unguarded sound, out before he'd decided to allow it. He could not remember the last time that had happened. Thomas, Daniel's 11-year-old son, met his grandfather for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in December. Vincent brought a baseball glove, well made, tan leather with dark stitching, the kind that still smells the way baseball gloves are supposed to smell, raw hide and linseed oil, and something close to possibility. Thomas turned it over in his hands, pressing his fingers into the pocket, feeling the weight of it. He looked up at this large, quiet, serious man his father had brought home and said, "Did you play?" Vincent said, "A long time ago." Thomas said, "Will you teach me?" A pause. Not long. The length of a man looking at 3 generations in a single question, understanding what is being offered and what it means to accept it. Then Vincent said, "Yes, I will." There is a photograph from that afternoon. Plain wooden frame on Daniel's mantel. 3 men, 3 generations, the same jaw carried across time. Vincent in the center, one hand on his son's shoulder, the other resting on his grandson's. All 3 squinting slightly into the December sun coming through the window. None of them are smiling exactly. They are simply there, present, real. Accounted for. The Hanan and Biag anchor visible on Daniel's neck, permanent and unchanged, the way certain things remain when everything around them shifts. Margaret still goes to Millie's every Tuesday morning. Corner booth near the window, black coffee, worn leather Bible on the table beside it. And sometimes, on the good mornings, a man in a dark suit walks through the door and takes the stool at the counter. They don't talk about regret. They don't reconstruct the years. They talk about Thomas, about baseball, about school, about the small, ordinary details of lives that have found their way back into range of each other. In the December photograph on Daniel's mantel, the Hanan and Biag anchor is visible on his neck, unchanged, permanent. The same ink he put there at 21 when his father handed him a folded piece of paper across a table and said nothing except that it had kept him honest. Daniel never covered it. Not once. Not in 30 years of silence. Not in 30 years of distance. Not in any of the years between. Some things, it turns out, don't wait to be asked. And if this story brought someone to mind, someone you've been meaning to reach, sit with that for a moment. We'll be here when you're ready for the next one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you soon.